Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're tackling a pretty timely book, Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century.
Right.
Basically, he's a historian. And in this book, he's arguing that if we really understand 20th century European history, we'll have some really vital tools for protecting democracy today.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and I think this deep dive will be really valuable for our listeners because we're going to try to distill these 20 lessons that Snyder talks about down to a crash course on resisting tyranny.
Yeah. And I think Snyder's book is so valuable because he doesn't just talk about the big picture stuff. He gets into these really specific examples from history.
Right.
And he starts right off the bat with this idea of anticipatory obedience. It's his first lesson.
Anticipatory obedience.
Yeah, it's this idea that people can actually give power to authoritarianism by just trying to guess what a repressive government wants even before they're told what to do.
So if a new power takes over, you start changing your behavior to please them, even if it goes against your beliefs.
Exactly. And Snyder uses this really chilling example of Austrians welcoming the Nazis.
Wow.
He points out that many Austrians didn't just accept the takeover. They actively participated, looting Jewish businesses, reporting their neighbors.
That's disturbing. It's like those small acts of compliance just add up to something way bigger and scarier.
Absolutely. And it really makes you think, what would I have done in that situation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, would I have been one of the people who stood up or would I have just gone along with it?
It's a tough question to ask yourself. And Snyder brings up the Milgram experiment,
Right, heard of that.
done at Yale back in 1961, where they found that regular people were shockingly willing to inflict pain on others just because some guy in a lab coat told them to.
I always think about that experiment. It's like, how could they do that? It's just so wrong.
Oh.
But how does that connect to defending democracy today?
Well, it shows how easily we can fall into that trap of obeying authority without questioning it. And that leads right into his second lesson, which is all about defending institutions.
Okay.
They're not self-sustaining.
Yeah.
We have to actively protect them even when things seem okay.
Because it's so easy to think, oh, that could never happen here.
Right.
And then Snyder talks about, the German Jews in 1933
Yeah.
who kind of assumed that Hitler wouldn't actually dismantle democratic institutions.
Right. They put their faith in the system and, well, we know what happened.
Yeah. And that's a perfect example of how apathy and inaction can just completely erode democracy, even in places that seem stable.
And, if we're not careful, that anticipatory obedience we were talking about earlier can create an environment where a single party takes over.
So let's say that happens. What are the dangers of a one-party state?
Well, Snyder warns us about that in Lesson 3, Beware the One-Party State. He argues that one-party systems crush pluralism and dissent, and opposing voices are silenced, which makes it really hard to challenge those in power.
And even if we think our system is safe, we still have to support a multi-party system and fair elections and be involved at the local and state level.
Absolutely. And Snyder doesn't just talk about those big, obvious power grabs. He also talks about the subtle ways tyranny can sneak into everyday life, like the power of symbols. That's Lesson 4.
Okay, how can symbols be a threat to democracy?
Well, think about how symbols can normalize hate and exclusion,
Right.
often without us even realizing it. Snyder uses the example of the Nazis marking Jewish businesses. It wasn't just about ostracizing the Jewish community. It was about creating this climate of fear and resentment.
Right, and it reminds me of that greengrocer in Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless,
Oh, yeah.
where he puts up that pro-regime sign in his shop window, not because he believes it, but just to avoid trouble.
Exactly. Havel was writing about life under communism, but it's a powerful example of how even small acts of conformity can prop up an oppressive system.
Yeah, it makes you think about all the pressures we face to conform, even if it means going against our own values. And it's so relevant today with the internet and social media because these platforms use symbols constantly to try to shape perceptions and normalize certain ideologies.
That's a great point. And it brings us to another really important lesson, Lesson 9, the importance of language.
Okay, so how does language play into all of this?
Well, authoritarian regimes are experts at manipulating language. They use it to sow division and instill fear and justify their power grabs. Think about terms like extremism, terrorism, even the word emergency can be used to erode rights and silence opposition.
Yeah, those words are thrown around all the time in political discourse these days.
Right, and the more we hear them, the less meaning they have. They become these tools for manipulation.
It's like a call to action for all of us, to really dig deeper and question the narrative and not just accept things at face value.
Exactly, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the Milgram experiment and that human tendency to just obey authority without question.
Right.
And then if we connect that to the idea of professional ethics, that's lesson 5. It raises this huge question: how do we uphold our values when our leaders are setting a negative example?
And that's not just a hypothetical question. History is full of chilling examples where people in positions of authority have been complicit in terrible things.
Yeah, Snyder talks about Nazi Germany, where lawyers and doctors, even businessmen, became complicit in horrific acts.
It's like a cautionary tale for all of us, no matter what our profession is.
It is.
We have a responsibility to uphold ethical standards, even when it's difficult, even when people in power are pressuring us to do otherwise.
And that takes courage to stand up and say no when you see something wrong happening. And that's something that Snyder really emphasizes in Lesson 8, Stand Out.
And he uses some great examples of individuals who did just that right. People like Winston Churchill, who refused to appease Hitler, or Teresa Prekarowa, who risked her own life to save Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Yeah, these were people who refused to conform even when it was dangerous, and their actions remind us that even small acts of resistance can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. And that leads us to something else. Snyder warns us about paramilitary's Lesson 6.
Yeah, that's a topic that feels especially relevant today, with the increasing presence of private security forces, and it feels like those lines between private power and state authority are getting blurred.
That's exactly what Snyder's warning us about. He looks at historical examples like the Nazi SA and SS and shows how these groups can create a climate of fear and violence, often operating outside the bounds of the law.
Right.
And it makes you think about Lesson 7, be reflective if you must be armed.
Yes, Snyder argues that unquestioning obedience to authority, especially when armed, can have devastating consequences. And he uses the role of ordinary police in the Holocaust to illustrate that point.
It's a chilling reminder that power, in any form, comes with huge responsibility.
It certainly does, and it brings us to another theme that's incredibly relevant in our world today: truth.
Yeah, lesson number 10, believe in truth. Snyder says that if we abandon facts, we're basically abandoning freedom.
Exactly. If nothing is true, then there's no basis for criticizing power or holding leaders accountable or even having a shared reality.
Which feels very familiar these days with all the disinformation and fake news. It's like everyone has their own version of the truth.
And Snyder breaks down exactly how truth dies in 4 specific ways.
Okay, so how does truth die?
Well, first you have the outright lies presented as if they were facts.
Oh, we see that all the time.
Right. And then you have the second mode, repetition. The more you hear something, even if it's a lie, the more likely you are to start believing it.
Like it wears you down.
Exactly. And then there's the magical thinking.
Okay.
Embracing contradictions and making promises that are impossible to keep.
Appealing to emotions instead of reason.
Exactly. And then finally you have the misplaced faith, the belief that one person, a leader, has all the answers and can solve all our problems.
Which feels especially dangerous these days.
It is, because when faith in a leader replaces critical thinking, that's when tyranny can really take root.
It's like giving up our own ability to think for ourselves.
Right. And Snyder offers this really powerful counterforce to all of this investigative journalism Lesson 11 investigates.
So he's saying we shouldn't just passively consume information, we need to actively seek out the truth.
Exactly. Investigative journalists play a crucial role in uncovering the truth, holding power accountable, giving us a more accurate picture of reality than what we might get from just headlines or social media.
And he gives us some practical tips for doing that, right? Like supporting print media and being careful about what we see online.
He even suggests learning more about sites that investigate propaganda, because a lot of the disinformation we see online originates from abroad.
So it's like we need to be more discerning about the information we consume.
Mm-hmm.
We have to think critically about where it's coming from.
Absolutely. We can't just be passive observers. We have to be active participants in figuring out what's true.
And that makes me think about something else. Snyder suggested, honestly, surprised me at first. Lesson 12, make eye contact and small talk.
Small talk?
Yeah, as a way to resist tyranny. I was like,
No, it sounds strange. But think about what life is like under totalitarian regimes. People are often afraid to even talk to each other,
right?
For fear of being denounced or reported to the authorities. So in that context, even a simple act of acknowledging someone, having a friendly conversation, can be a way of showing solidarity and building trust.
It's a way of reminding ourselves that we're part of a community.
Exactly. And those human connections are so vital in times of crisis.
Which leads us to Lesson 13, practice corporeal politics.
Yes.
Snyder's arguing that real change doesn't just happen online. It requires physical presence, putting yourself out there, building coalitions, taking it to the streets.
He uses the example of the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was this incredible coalition of workers, professionals, members of the Catholic Church,
Wow.
all these different people who came together in the 1980s to challenge communist rule.
It's a great example of how collective action can create lasting change.
And it all starts with people connecting with each other, building trust, and taking action together.
So how do we balance that call to action with protecting ourselves and our communities?
That's a great question, and it brings us to lesson 14. Establish a private life.
Establish a private life.
Yeah.
How does that fit into resisting tyranny?
Well, Snyder's point is that authoritarian regimes thrive on information.
Okay.
If they can access your personal information, your communications, they can use it against you.
To manipulate you, intimidate you, even blackmail you.
Exactly. And he gives some practical advice here, like being careful about what you share online, securing your devices, even considering alternative forms of communication that are less susceptible to surveillance.
So it's about protecting our privacy, both for ourselves and for our democracy.
Exactly. He's not saying we should all become hermits
Right.
and disconnect from the world, but we need to be smart about how we engage with technology.
And it goes back to what we were talking about before about the importance of face-to-face interaction.
Absolutely.
So finding that balance between online engagement and real-world connections.
Exactly. And those connections, those communities, are often built around shared values and a desire to make a positive impact. Which brings us to lesson 15, contribute to good causes.
Okay, now that's something I can get behind.
Right.
But how does contributing to good causes tie into resisting tyranny?
Well, Snyder argues that supporting charities and organizations that align with our values is a way to strengthen civil society. And a strong civil society is the bedrock of a healthy democracy.
So it's about more than just writing a check or volunteering. It's about being an active participant in something larger than ourselves.
And it gives us a sense of agency, too. You know, in a world that can feel chaotic and out of control, knowing that we're making a positive difference, even in a small way, can be really empowering.
It's like we're not just sitting back and letting things happen to us. We're taking action. We're working together to make a difference.
Exactly. And those individual acts of courage and compassion can have a ripple effect, inspiring others to do the same.
Right. And it reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about learning from others who are facing similar challenges in different parts of the world.
That's lesson 16, learn from peers in other countries. Snyder reminds us that tyranny is rarely confined to just one nation.
Right.
And he encourages us to stay informed about what's happening around the world and learn from the experiences of others who have faced similar threats to their freedom.
And he even uses the example of how Eastern European observers were more accurate in predicting the outcome of the 2016 U.S. election than a lot of American political analysts.
Right. They had lived through similar experiences, and they were able to recognize patterns of authoritarian behavior that many Americans, maybe because of our own sense of exceptionalism, missed.
It's a reminder that we can't be complacent.
Yeah.
We have to be aware of what's happening in the world and learn from others who have faced similar challenges.
Absolutely. And those challenges often involve the manipulation of language and information.
Which brings us to lesson 17. Listen for dangerous words.
Yes.
Okay, we talked about the importance of language before, but are there any specific words or phrases that we should be listening for?
Snyder specifically cautions us to be on the lookout for terms like extremism and terrorism, because those are words that are often used by people who are trying to consolidate power, to silence dissent, and justify repressive measures.
So like how extremists can become a catch-all term for anyone who disagrees with the government.
Exactly. It's a way of demonizing the opposition and creating this false sense of unity where it's us versus them.
And terrorism is a real and serious threat.
Of course.
But can also be used to instill fear and justify policies that erode our civil liberties.
That's right. And it makes me think about lesson 18, be calm when the unthinkable arrives. Snyder's talking about how authoritarians exploit moments of crisis like Paris attacks to consolidate their power and push through their agendas.
It's like they take advantage of fear and panic to do things that they wouldn't be able to get away with under normal circumstances.
Exactly. And history is full of examples of this tactic being used.
Like 9/11.
Yes. Or think about the Reichstag fire in 1933. Hitler used that event, which may or may not have even been orchestrated by the Nazis themselves, to justify suspending basic rights, arresting political opponents, and ultimately transforming Germany into a one-party state.
And we've seen this kind of thing happen more recently too, right? Yeah. Putin's rise to power was fueled in part by his response to a series of apartment bombings that were pretty convenient for his political ambitions.
Absolutely. And then there's the war on terror after 9/11, which was used to justify the invasion of Iraq. the expansion of surveillance programs, and the erosion of civil liberties in the United States.
It's scary to think about how easily our freedoms can be taken away in the name of security.
It is, and it's a reminder that we need to be especially vigilant and critical in times of crisis. We can't let fear and panic cloud our judgment or allow us to just surrender our freedoms without a fight.
That's a really important point. We need to be aware of the potential for manipulation, especially when emotions are running high.
You're right, and that brings us to something else Snyder emphasizes, which might seem a little unexpected in this context. Be a patriot. That's lesson 19.
Be a patriot.
Yeah.
I mean, that feels like a word that's often used to justify blind loyalty or unquestioning support for the government. So, how does Snyder define patriotism in the context of resisting tyranny?
Well, he defines it in a way that challenges those traditional notions of blind allegiance. He argues that true patriotism isn't about waving flags or chanting slogans. It's about actively defending the values that make a country worth loving in the first place.
So it's about more than just blind loyalty. It's about holding our leaders accountable, speaking out against injustice, and working to make our country a better place for all citizens.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that loving your country means wanting it to live up to its ideals, even if that means criticizing its flaws and working to correct them.
That's a much more nuanced and active definition of patriotism than what we usually hear from politicians. And it leads perfectly into the final lesson. Be as courageous as you can.
Lesson 20, and this is really the culmination of all the previous lessons. Snyder reminds us that courage doesn't always mean these big heroic acts.
Right.
It can be as simple as speaking the truth, standing up for what's right, defending institutions, connecting with others, refusing to be complicit in injustice.
It's those everyday acts of resistance, those small choices that we make, that can add up to something much bigger.
Exactly. And sometimes those small acts can be the hardest because they require us to be vulnerable, to step outside our comfort zones, and to risk the disapproval of others.
But as Snyder says, if none of us is prepared to die for freedom, will any of us be prepared to live for it?
That's a powerful question, and it really gets to the heart of what it means to be a citizen in a democracy.
Yeah, it's not just about enjoying our rights and freedoms, it's about actively protecting them, even when it's difficult or risky.
And that's what I hope you'll take away from this deep dive. You now have these 20 lessons drawn from the experiences of people who lived through some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century.
And it's a reminder that the fight for democracy is ongoing, and it's a fight that requires all of us to be engaged and informed and courageous.
So share these lessons with others, have conversations, be active in your communities, and never give up on the idea of a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. It's been a really thought-provoking exploration of what it means to resist tyranny and safeguard democracy. And remember, history doesn't repeat, but it does instruct.
It sure does. And it all ties back to how truth can be manipulated, especially by people seeking power.
Yeah, that was Lesson 10, Believe in Truth, where Snyder argues that if we abandon facts, we're basically abandoning freedom.
Exactly.
It's so relevant today with all the disinformation out there.
It is, and Snyder really breaks down how truth dies in 4 ways.
Oh, yeah.
And it's kind of chilling how accurately it describes what we're seeing in some places today. So
Yeah.
first, you have just straight up lies, presented as if they were facts.
Oh, we see that constantly these days with politicians and media figures just making claims that are easily debunked, but they keep repeating them over and over again.
Right, and that repetition is the second mode. The more you hear something, even if it's false, the more likely you are to start to believe it.
So like our brains just get exhausted by the constant barrage of information.
Yeah, they get worn down. And then there's the magical thinking, embracing contradictions, making promises that are impossible to keep.
So like appealing to emotions instead of logic or evidence.
Exactly. They're selling the feeling, not the reality.
Right. And then finally you have that misplaced faith, the blind trust in a leader believing they have all the answers.
It is, and that's so dangerous because when faith in a leader replaces critical thinking, that's when tyranny can take root.
You're giving up your own agency, your ability to think for yourself.
Exactly, and Snyder offers this really powerful counterforce to all of this investigative journalism. Lesson 11, investigate.
Okay, so he's encouraging us to not just passively consume information, but to actually actively seek out the truth.
Yes. Investigative journalists are crucial for uncovering the truth and holding power accountable. They give us a more accurate picture of what's going on than we get from just headlines or social media.
And he has some good advice on how to do that, right? Like spending time with longer, more in-depth articles, supporting print media, being careful about what we see online.
Yeah, and he even suggests learning more about sites that investigate propaganda campaigns because So much of the disinformation we see online originates from outside our own country.
So we need to develop this whole new set of skills to navigate the information landscape these days, you know?
Right.
We have to be like media detectives trying to figure out what's reliable, what's biased, what's intentionally misleading.
You got it. We can't just be passive consumers of information anymore.
Yeah.
We have to be active, critical participants in figuring out what's true.
And that makes me think about something else Snyder suggests. That honestly surprised me at first. Lesson 12, make eye contact and small talk.
Small talk, really?
I know. I was like, what?
To resist tyranny, right? It sounds strange,
Yeah.
but think about it for a second. What's it like to live under a totalitarian regime? People are often afraid to even talk to each other.
Oh, absolutely.
Worried about being reported to the authorities for saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So in that context, even just acknowledging someone, making eye contact, having a conversation can be a way of showing solidarity, building trust.
Yeah, reminding ourselves that we're not just isolated individuals.
Right, we're part of a community.
And those connections are so important, especially during times of crisis.
They are, which brings us to lesson 13, practice corporeal politics.
Yeah.
Snyder's arguing that real change doesn't just happen online. You have to get out there, be physically present,
Okay.
put yourself out there, take it to the streets.
Be in the world.
Exactly. He uses the example of the solidarity movement in Poland. It was this amazing coalition of workers, professionals, even members of the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
They came together in the 1980s to challenge communist rule. And it all started with people connecting with each other, talking to each other, building trust, taking risks together.
So it really is about showing up.
It is.
So how do we balance that call to action, to get out there and be involved with protecting ourselves and our communities?
That's the question. And it brings us to lesson 14, establish a private life.
Establish a private life. How does that tie into resisting tyranny? It sounds like he's saying we should retreat from the world.
No, not at all. But he's reminding us that authoritarian regimes, they thrive on information. The more they know about you, the more they can use that information against you.
Yeah, to manipulate you, intimidate you, even blackmail you into compliance.
Exactly. And he gives some practical tips here, like being careful about what we share online, securing our devices, even considering using alternative forms of communication that are less susceptible to surveillance.
So it's about protecting our privacy.
Yes, for ourselves and for our democracy.
But he's not saying we should all become hermits, right?
No, of course not.
Like disconnect from everything.
He's just saying we need to be smart about how we use technology.
Be mindful.
Right.
And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the importance of those face-to-face interactions.
It does.
So finding that balance between online engagement and real-world connections.
Yes. And those connections, those communities are often built around shared values, a desire to make a positive impact. Which brings us to lesson 15, contribute to good causes.
Okay, now that's something I can get behind, but how does contributing to good causes tie into resisting tyranny?
Well, Snyder argues that supporting charities and organizations that align with our values is a way to strengthen civil society, the groups and institutions that make up a society.
Right.
And a strong civil society is essential for a healthy democracy.
So it's about more than just writing a check or volunteering your time.
Yes.
It's about being an active participant in something larger than yourself, contributing to the common good.
Exactly. And it gives us a sense of agency, too.
Yeah.
In a world that can feel chaotic and out of control, knowing that we're making a positive difference, even a small one, can be really empowering.
It's like you're not just sitting back and letting things happen. You're taking action. You're working with others to make a difference.
And those individual acts of courage and compassion can inspire others to do the same. It can have a ripple effect.
It reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about learning from others who are facing similar challenges in other parts of the world.
Yes, that's lesson 16. Learn from peers in other countries. Snyder reminds us that tyranny is rarely confined to just one nation.
Right.
And he encourages us to stay informed about what's going on around the world and to learn from the experiences of others who have faced similar threats to their freedoms.
He even gave the example of how Eastern European observers were more accurate in predicting the outcome of the 2016 U.S. election than a lot of American political analysts were.
Yeah, they had lived through similar experiences and were able to see patterns of authoritarian behavior that many Americans, maybe because of our own sense of exceptionalism, just missed.
It's a good reminder that we can't be complacent. We have to be aware of what's happening in the world and learn from the experiences of others.
Absolutely. And those challenges often involve, the manipulation of language and information.
Which brings us to lesson 17. Listen for dangerous words.
Right.
Okay, we talked about the importance of language earlier. But are there any specific words or phrases that we should be listening for, like red flags?
Snyder specifically tells us to watch out for terms like extremism and terrorism,
Okay.
because they're often used by people trying to consolidate power, to silence dissent and justify repressive measures.
So like how extremists can become this catch-all term for anyone who disagrees with the government.
Exactly. It's a way to demonize the opposition, create this false sense of unity. It's us versus them.
Right? And terrorism, while a very real threat, can also be used to instill fear and justify policies that erode our civil liberties.
That's right. And it makes me think about Lesson 18. Be calm when the unthinkable arrives. Snyder's talking about how authoritarians use moments of crisis to their advantage.
Yeah.
Like terrorist attacks.
It's like they exploit that fear and panic.
Exactly, to push through their agendas and do things that they wouldn't normally be able to get away with.
And we've seen this happen a lot throughout history, haven't we?
Think about the Reichstag fire in 1933.
Right.
Hitler used that event, which might not have even been started by the Nazis, to justify suspending basic rights, arresting his opponents, and basically turning Germany into a one-party state.
Yeah, and we've seen it more recently, too. Putin's rise to power was fueled, at least in part, by his response to those apartment bombings that were suspiciously convenient for his political ambitions.
Oh, absolutely. And we can't forget about the war on terror after 9/11, which was used to justify all sorts of things. The invasion of Iraq, the expansion of surveillance programs, the erosion of civil liberties in the United States.
It's scary to think about how easily our freedoms can be taken away in the name of security.
It is, and it's a reminder that we need to be really careful in times of crisis. We can't just let fear and panic take over and allow our leaders to take away our freedoms without a fight.
That's a really important point. We need to be aware of how easily we could be manipulated when we're afraid.
Absolutely, which leads us to something that Snyder emphasizes that might seem kind of unexpected in this context. Be a patriot. That's lesson 19.
Be a patriot. That's an interesting one because that word is so often used to justify blind loyalty to the government.
Yeah.
So how does Snyder define patriotism in this context of resisting tyranny?
He defines it in a way that really challenges those traditional ideas, about blind allegiance.
Yeah.
He says that true patriotism isn't about waving flags or chanting slogans. It's about actively defending the values that make a country worth loving.
So it's about more than just blind loyalty.
Right.
It's about holding leaders accountable and speaking out against injustice and working to make the country a better place for everyone.
Exactly. It's recognizing that loving your country means wanting it to live up to its ideals, even if that means criticizing it and working to change it.
A much more active definition of patriotism than we usually hear, and it connects really well with the final lesson. Be as courageous as you can.
Lesson 20. This is like the culmination of all the other lessons.
Yeah.
Snyder's reminding us that courage doesn't have to be these big, heroic acts,
Right.
It can be as simple as telling the truth, standing up for what's right, defending institutions, connecting with others, refusing to participate in things that, are wrong.
It's those everyday acts of resistance that can make a difference.
Exactly. And sometimes those everyday acts, they're the hardest ones, because they require us to be vulnerable, to take risks.
To put ourselves out there.
And to face, disapproval or even backlash from others.
But as Snyder says, if none of us is prepared to die for freedom, will any of us be prepared to live for it?
That's a really powerful question, and it really makes you think about what it means to be a citizen in a democracy.
Yeah, it's not just about enjoying our rights and freedoms. It's about actively protecting them, even when it's hard.
Exactly, and that's what I hope people will take away from this deep dive. You now have these 20 lessons from people who lived through some of the darkest times in history.
It's a reminder that we always have to be vigilant. The fight for democracy never really ends.
Yeah, right.
And it requires all of us to be engaged and informed and courageous.
So share these lessons with others, talk about them with your friends and family, get involved in your community, and never give up on the idea of a better future.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny. It's been a really fascinating and thought-provoking look at what it means to resist tyranny and protect democracy. And as Snyder says, history doesn't repeat, but it does instruct.
It sure does.
It's easy to feel a little overwhelmed by everything we've talked about, all the historical examples, the warning signs Snyder lays out.
Right.
But he's not trying to scare us, is he?
No, I don't think so. I think he's trying to give us the tools we need.
To understand how it happens.
Yeah, to recognize how tyranny takes root and what we can do about it.
And it really does come down to individual choices, doesn't it?
It does in a lot of ways, those everyday acts of courage and defiance.
Like you say, don't wait for some big heroic moment.
Yeah.
The fight's happening now in the choices we make every day.
That's a great way to put it. And those choices don't have to be huge, dramatic things. It can be as simple as speaking up when you see injustice, defending people who are being marginalized, refusing to participate in systems that are wrong.
And sometimes those small acts are the hardest ones, aren't they?
They are, because they require us to be vulnerable.
Right.
Step outside our comfort zones, risk being disliked or even punished for what we believe in.
But to quote Snyder, if none of us is prepared to die for freedom, will any of us be prepared to live for it?
That's a really powerful question.
It is. It makes you think about what it really means to live in a democracy.
Right.
It's not just about enjoying our freedoms, it's about protecting them.
And sometimes that means taking risks.
Exactly. And it's not always about those grand acts of self-sacrifice, is it?
No, not at all. It's about the everyday choices, those small acts of resistance that can really add up.
Creating a culture of defiance?
Yeah, building those networks of support, those communities that can sustain us when things get tough.
And it's about understanding that the fight for democracy isn't limited to one place or one time. It's happening everywhere, isn't it?
It is. It's a global fight.
Which brings us back to that idea of learning from others. From people who are fighting for freedom in different parts of the world.
Exactly. It's about breaking out of our own bubbles and connecting with people who have different experiences, different perspectives.
It's not just about learning from others, it's about working with them.
You're right. Building solidarity across borders.
Sharing strategies for resistance, supporting each other when things get tough.
We're all in this together. The fight for democracy is a global one, and we're stronger when we stand together.
And that brings us back to those 20 lessons that Snyder outlines in his book. They're not just abstract ideas, they're tools that we can use to build a better world.
A more just and equitable and democratic world.
They remind us that we can learn from the past.
That history doesn't repeat, but it does instruct.
And if we pay attention to the lessons of history, we can be more prepared to face the challenges of today and create a better future.
That's what I hope people take away from this conversation.
Me too. It's been so great exploring these ideas with you.
Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Timothy Snyder's McCarthy. On Tyranny, we hope it's left you feeling informed and inspired and ready to do your part to protect democracy.